look at the anatomy of the female body versus the male body, I mean, there are clear differences between the two. However, when you look at the female and the male brain, do we have those clearly visible kind of differences? And if so, how do they manifest themselves?
I guess we've always looked at, does the biology differ? So when we look at the actual physical structure of a human brain, we only see one glaring anatomical difference, and that is that typically male brains are bigger than female brains. And that actually simply has to do with the fact that men are typically larger than women.
Hey guys, I'm here on set recording for our upcoming mini-series, and one of the sessions is going to involve a psychologist. Because of the pandemic, we thought, look, let's share a little bit more than what we're going to share on the series, and so that we can have enough information to be able to help the public to be able to manage their minds effectively. One of the topics that we're going to talk about today is the mind, the brain, and sex. So basically, from the mind perspective, we want to explore the difference between the male and the female mindset and the male and the female brain. And then we also want to see from the mental perspective as to what impact does sex have on the mind. So I've brought here my psychologist, Anthony. I don't call him doctor, so this to me is almost like a psychological therapy of some sort, but I'm bringing you guys into this so that we can access information and get better results in managing our minds during this pandemic. Anthony, let's get to know more about you and your education that you've studied and your speciality. You are a registered clinical psychologist. You also specialize in forensic psychology. Now that to me was a bit dark, because when I think of forensic, I think of investigation, I think of crime, I think of people who've committed murders. So I want you to touch on that so that we can know exactly what it is. And then you also specialize in one of my favorite topics, which is neuropsychology. I don't think you know this, but this is one of the fields that I was considering studying on a long-term basis and PhD level, because I found that I'm so interested in the mind and the brain and how the two interact, and how I think my main interest is how do we get the two working together to produce great results, right? So tell us about the specialities. I mean, let's start with the forensic one.
Absolutely, Tabo, and I'm glad we're getting a chance to talk about them, simply because these aren't fields that we get to talk about enough in a South African context. So, as a qualified clinical psychologist, that means that I do all the things you would typically expect a psychologist to do. That means understanding life difficulties, making diagnoses, and offering ways to improve our well-being, either by dealing with different forms of intervention on an individual basis, or by helping people within relationships, as couples or as families, to make things better. When we look at special interests, there are two areas that are big for me. So the first of these is the one you just mentioned, forensic psychology. So forensic psychology definitely does have that dark connotation of serial killers and these sorts of things, and that is part of it. But forensic psychology is actually much broader than this. Forensic psychology refers to any aspect of psychology as it's applied to a legal matter. So there are two principal branches of it. There's civil forensics and criminal forensics. In civil forensic, this is when a psychologist will conduct assessments or give therapy in order to help a situation that's actually a matter between two parties. This could include things like seeing if someone is fit to give a last will and testament, a child custody assessment, mediation, or even parenting coordination. So it's usually helping people and families with legal matters and giving assessments and opinions to make determinations in people's best interests. Essentially, it means the psychologist is offering evidence to help a court make a decision. The criminal aspect is part of it, and usually that means that we assess criminal offenders to see if they could be held criminally culpable for a crime, if they're fit to stand trial. And then there's a really small part of forensic psychology called investigative psychology in South Africa, which is about helping the police make sense of psychologically motivated crimes, such as serial killers. So while that's part of the job, it's certainly not a massive part of it. That's really around the forensic side of things.
Okay, so neuro is coming from neurology, which means the study of the brain, and psychology is the study of the mind. So the two together, does it mean the study of the brain and the mind and how the two interact with each other? So yeah, just tell us a little bit about the neurology side of psychology.
Absolutely, and Timlani, your passion is clear there, because that's pretty much exactly what it means. In psychology, we're studying the mind. Basically what that means is we're studying the software. We want to understand what thought processes and emotional processes mean in our everyday behaviors and in our relationships. The neuro part means that we're understanding the biology underpinning those mental processes. It's kind of like learning the hard way. So in neuroscience, we learn about the biology, which could be how brain areas work and what they do. And in psychology, we're understanding the software, how those biological processes lead to some of the things we see in our lives, how we think, how we feel, and why we behave the way we do. So it's really trying to merge those two streams together to help us understand how our biological origins lead to our psychological processes.
You studied in the UK, and tell us a little bit more about your studies in the UK and your experience.
So the time I spent in the UK was studying neuroscience in its fullest sense. I got an opportunity to study everything from neurobiology, so the way your brain is structured, all the way to things like cognitive neurophysiology, which is about understanding how different brain regions interact to give rise to our different emotions and our different thoughts. So essentially it gave me a chance to understand how the hardware operates so that I could better understand how the software works.
Makes sense. When we look at the anatomy of the female body versus the male body, I mean, there are clear differences between the two. However, when you look at the female and the male brain, do we have those clearly visible kind of differences? And if so, how do they manifest themselves?
Well, it's interesting for us to consider because we've always observed differences, I suppose, in the typical way that men and women behave, relate, and sometimes think and feel. I guess we've always looked at, does the biology differ? So when we look at the actual physical structure of a human brain, we only see one glaring anatomical difference, and that is that typically male brains are bigger than female brains. And that actually simply has to do with the fact that men are typically larger than women. Now, for a long time, we had a very problematic conclusion drawn from this, which is that many people thought because men have larger physical brains, that means this somehow reflects higher intelligence. And of course, we know from research, it absolutely doesn't. A bigger brain does not necessarily mean a better brain, because by that logic, whales would be much smarter than we are. They have much bigger brains than we do, doesn't necessarily mean they're more capable than us. So we know that size is a difference, but it's not really meaningful. It just seems to be a reflection of anatomy. When we look at the way, however, these brains operate, we do see a couple things. The first thing is to recognize that there are more similarities between men and women than there are differences. So the male brain and the female brain operate more similarly than they are in difference. But there are some significant differences. The major difference we note is that for men, we typically see that their brains usually involve more analytical, systematic, and logic thinking. So this usually means that we see more of the left side operating in its own right because we've got these two halves. For women, we see more what we call cerebral lateralization, and all that means is that women tend to use both halves of the brain more commonly in a lot of processes. So that means that women don't just think systematically and logically, they have much more focus on empathy, emotional reasoning, and intuition. So the real difference that we see more often than not is men are more commonly interested in systems and things, women are typically more interested in emotions and people. But it is important to bear in mind, for every rule, there is an exception. So while this is a general trend, it's entirely possible to meet women who are more interested in things and systems and men who are more interested in people and relationships. It's possible to have a little bit of both, and we usually have a blend, but on the extreme ends, we usually see that difference between men and women.
Yes, I find myself being more having a little bit of a female brain at some point, because I find that I have more empathy, and I think empathy and excellence is what works for retail. I think that's why I've got a little bit of passion where retail is concerned as well. I think then the difference kind of explain why women tend to be more emotional than men. Not to say men are not more emotional, but I think because of the left and the right side that you've explained, on general terms, it kind of makes sense. Now, let's go more to the mind. And I want to know specifically now on the mind as to how does the mind link to the brain? Let's say now you have a female who's thinking more with the left side of the brain, where we're talking about emotions, we're talking about the line that comes from here, coming down to your ears, and the music part. And so what then happens to the mind? Because I know obviously the mind is separate from the brain, right? And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but now they work together somehow, like the emotional part of a female obviously then links to the mind somehow. So let's explore that link, that relationship between the mind and the brain, so that we can have a crystal clear picture of how is this thing working, and we can understand each other better, because if we don't have this information, we can easily downplay the female, and the female can easily downplay the male with how they're seeing things and how they're processing their mind. So let's explore that a little bit more.
I'm happy to. And the question you're raising is one of, if not the most important psychological questions we've ever asked, which is what are the mind and the brain, and what is the relationship between them? So there've actually been two schools of thought as to how this works. The one saw the mind and the brain as two separate and distinct things. And this actually was one of the ways of thinking that sparked off psychology as a discipline, because it helped us think about whether that's the case. And all the evidence that we have today actually tells us something rather intriguing, which is that the mind and the brain are one and the same thing. So the way we think about it is like this. If you have a projector, you have this big machine, and that machine sends across the room onto a picture, onto a wall or a screen, a set of pictures. The mind and the brain kind of work like that. You can think of the brain as the projector, the physical structure. It's a machine that does certain things. But the images that pop up, those are like the mind. Now the reason we've got to think about it this way is that, of course, the pictures that are created are far more interesting than the projector ever could be. But when that projector breaks down, the images can't come through. So what we've learned is that the mind is really a reflection of the brain. So if certain parts of the brain don't work, certain parts of the mind don't necessarily work. So the mind is very much dependent on this material brain, even though it feels rather intriguing and different.